outside. 911, what's your emergency?
Hello everyone, welcome to episode 10 of my series, Crafts and Crimes. Every week I post a new video of myself crafting while talking about a different true crime case. This week I will be talking about the crimes of Ivan Robert Marco Milat, also known as the backpacker murderer. Ivan Milat was born on December 27, 1944 in Guildford, New South Wales, Australia. He was the fifth of 14 children born to Croatian immigrant Stepan Marko Milat, known by friends and family as Stephen, and his mother, Elizabeth Piddleston, was an Australian national. The Milat family lived in Bosley Park, west of Sydney, before relocating to the Sydney suburb of Liverpool. Stephen and Elizabeth were described as being conscientious when raising, educating, and disciplining their children. All 14 children were sent to Catholic school. Unfortunately, Stephen was also an alcoholic and was described by family members as having a temper. Many of the 10 Milat boys were known to the police and were used to handling firearms and knives. They often spent the afternoons shooting at targets in their parents' backyard. Ivan Milat's siblings described him as displaying antisocial and psychotic behavior at a young age. One example they gave was of him attacking animals with a machete when they were children. His older brother Boris once said, quote, "He was going to kill somebody from the age of 10. It was built into him. I knew he was on a one-way trip. I knew that it was just a matter of how long." This behavior led to a stint in a residential school for Milat at the age of 13. At 17, he found himself in a juvenile detention center for theft. When he was 19, he was involved in a shop break-in. In 1964, Ivan was sentenced to 18 months in prison for breaking and entering. 1 month after being released from prison, he was arrested for driving a stolen car. This landed him with a sentence of 2 years hard labor. In September 1967, Milat was once again sentenced to prison time for theft, this time for 3 years. On April 7, 1971, Ivan Milat abducted 2 18-year-old female hitchhikers near Liverpool railway station. He sexually assaulted one of the hitchhikers before stopping at a petrol station cafe, where they were both able to escape. Milat was arrested later that same day for the crime and charged with 2 counts of armed robbery and 1 count of sexual assault. While awaiting trial, he committed a string of robberies with some of his brothers before faking his own suicide. Ivan Milat left a pair of his shoes at the Gap, a known suicide spot in Sydney, before fleeing to Queensland, Victoria, and then on to New Zealand. He stayed away for 2 years before sneaking back into Australia with a fake passport in either 1973 or 1974. In 1974, Elizabeth Milat was taken to the hospital after suffering a heart attack, and this was where Ivan was rearrested by the police. Unfortunately, the case failed during the trial, and he was released. Ivan was at it again in 1977 when he attempted to kidnap and sexually assault 2 female hitchhikers, but was unsuccessful, and he was never charged for the crime. In 1984, he married a woman 15 years his junior, but the marriage quickly went south. As a result of the failed marriage, he burned down the house of his ex-wife's parents in Newcastle, New South Wales. Until the mid-1990s, hitchhiking was considered an adventurous and relatively safe way of traveling across Australia. After a string of backpackers being reported missing between 1978 and 1991, those who still hitchhiked did so in pairs for safety. Victorian couple James Gibson and Deborah Everest, both 19, were last seen on December 30th, 1989. They were last seen leaving their hostel in Sydney on their way to Confest, an alternative lifestyle festival held near Aylbury. The couple was planning to hitchhike to the festival. Gibson's rucksack and camera were found at the Galston Gorge, but search of the area turned up nothing. German backpacker Simone Schmindel, 21 years old, was last seen on January 20th, 1990. She was hitchhiking from Sydney to Melbourne to meet her mother, who was visiting from Germany, but she never arrived. A pair of prescription glasses belonging to Simone were found in bushland near Bright in Victoria. The discovery of these glasses was made in May 1991. On Boxing Day, 1991, a German couple, Gabor Niembauer, 21, and Anja Habscheid, 20, were last seen when they left their King's Cross hostel to travel to Darwin. The couple were on the last leg of a backpacking tour around Asia and Australia and were looking forward to returning home. Their families flew out from Germany to search for the couple, but after 4 weeks of fruitless searching, they were forced to return home. Less than 4 months later, on April 18, 1992, British backpackers Caroline Clark, 21, and Joanne Walters, 22, both disappeared after leaving a hostel in King's Cross. They told other guests at the hostel that they were either going to go fruit picking in Riverina or hitchhike to Melbourne. On September 19, 1992, a concealed body was discovered by 2 runners in the Belanglo State Forest. The person was face down in the dirt with their hands bound behind their back. The following morning, police discovered a second body 98 feet from the first. Investigators were able to identify the bodies from dental records. They were Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, who went missing 5 months earlier. Caroline had been blindfolded and marched into the woods. She was then shot 10 times in the head. It is believed that her body was used for target practice. Joanne was found to have been sexually assaulted and stabbed 14 times. She had 4 stab wounds to her head, 1 to her chest, and 9 to her back, which had severed her spine. After a thorough search of the area, investigators ruled out the possibility of finding any additional bodies in the forest. On October 5th, 1993, a local man who was out deep in the Belanglo forest collecting firewood came across skeletal remains. The remains were identified as missing Victoria couple Deborah Everest and James Gibson. James was found in the fetal position, covered with stab wounds. There were 8 wounds in total. 1 was so deep in his upper back that it severed his spine, and the wounds to his chest would have punctured his heart and lungs. Deborah had been savagely beaten. Her skull was fractured in 2 places. She had a broken jaw, a knife wound on her forehead, and a single stab wound to her neck. The young couple were found less than 1 mile from Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, which puzzled investigators. A backpacking camera belonging to James was found over 75 miles away in Galston Gorge in North Sydney, and so it was expected their remains would have been found in that area. On November 1st, 1993, during a police sweep near a fire trail in Belanglo State Forest, a skeleton was found in a clearing. These remains were later identified as belonging to Simone Schmindel. Her remains bore evidence of 8 stab wounds. 2 of the wounds severed her spine. Others would have punctured her heart and lungs. Nearby, police found clothing that didn't belong to Simone, but to that of Anja Habscheid, who was also missing. A few days later, on November 4th, off another fire trail, police located the last of Milat's victims in a shallow grave. These remains were identified as Gabor Niembauer and Anja Habscheid, who went missing 2 years earlier. Gabor had been gagged and shot in the head 6 times. Anja had been decapitated by a single blow to the back of her neck, and unfortunately her skull was never located. Nearby investigators found a makeshift bondage device, which led them to believe she had been bound before her murder. There was evidence that some of the victims did not die immediately from their injuries. Police were able to conclusively link all the cases together. All 7 victims had disappeared under similar circumstances. They were all found in the same area, and they were all partially concealed with leaves and branches in the shape of a pyramid. They were also discovered face down with their hands bound behind their backs. Campsites were located close to all the areas where remains had been found. Matching bullets, shell casings, and cartridge boxes for 2 weapons were found at all the sites. Fear gripped the area as news of a serial killer began to spread. Some people believed that these were the crimes of 2 killers because several of the victims were abducted in pairs. It was around this time that people began referring to the crimes as the backpack murders. Investigators began to speculate that the killer or killers had to be from the area because of where the remains were found deep inside the forest. The theory was that the backpackers had been picked up while hitchhiking and driven to Belanglo State Forest against their will. Police did not believe that the crimes were financially motivated because none of their travelers' checks had been cashed or credit cards used. On October 14th, 1993, Task Force Air was established by the New South Wales Police Department. The task force consisted of more than 20 detectives and analysts. Public warnings were issued, particularly aimed at international backpackers, to avoid hitchhiking along the Hume Highway. On November 5th, the government increased the reward for information related to the killings to 500,000 Australian dollars. After developing their profile, police found an enormous amount of data from various sources. Using link analysis technology, they were able to narrow down the list of suspects from 230 to 32. The police were contacted by 24-year-old Paul Onions from the UK on November 13th, 1993. Onions had been backpacking in Australia a few years earlier, in January 1990, and while hitchhiking from near Liverpool Station towards Mildura, he was picked up by a man who called himself Bill. When they were less than a mile from Belanglo State Forest, Bill stopped and pulled out a revolver, telling him this was a robbery. Paul managed to flee, but Bill chased after him while firing the revolver. The backpacker was able to flag down a passing motorist named Joanne Barry, and the two sped off. They went immediately to Bowral Police Station, where the pair described the man and his vehicle to police. On April 13th, 1994, the police re-found the information provided by Paul Onions back in November. They contacted the Bowral Police Department for the original report, but unfortunately it had been lost. However, a female constable had recorded details in her notebook, and Paul's statements were corroborated by Joanne Barry, who had contacted the investigation team. The team were also contacted by the girlfriend of a man who worked with Ivan Milat and suggested they needed to look into him. Police surveillance of the Milat home in Eagle Vale began on February 26, 1994. They learned that Ivan had recently sold a silver Nissan Patrol not long after the discovery of the bodies of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. It was also confirmed that he had not been in work on any of the days where the backpackers went missing. Acquaintances told investigators about Milat's obsession with weapons. Paul Onions was flown to Sydney from London to help with the investigation. On May 5, 1994, he positively identified Ivan Milat as the man who had picked him up and attempted to murder him. Authorities reached out to 2 women who had a similar story to Paul. They were hitchhiking in 1977 near the forest and narrowly escaped murder by a man they described as having, quote, black scraggly hair. When shown a series of photographs, one of the women identified both Ivan Milat and his brother Richard. These photo identifications, alongside Milat's arrest in 1971 for the abduction and sexual assault of 2 female backpackers, led investigators to believe they had found the killer. 50 police officers, including many from the Tactical Operations Unit, surrounded the Milat home on May 22, 1994. Ivan Milat was initially arrested on robbery and weapons charges related to the attack on Paul Onions in 1990. While searching the house, police found several weapons, including a .22 caliber rifle and parts of a .22 caliber Ruger rifle that matched the type used in the murders, a Browning pistol, and a Bowie knife. They also discovered foreign currency, clothing, a tent, sleeping bags, camping equipment, and cameras, all belonging to several of the victims. At the same time, police were searching the homes of his mother and 5 of his brothers. These additional searches turned up over 500 pounds of ammunition, 24 guns, and more items belonging to the victims. Ivan Milat appeared in court on May 23, 1994, but he didn't enter a plea. He was charged with the murders of the 7 backpackers on May 31st. On June 28th, Milat fired his defense lawyer and sought legal aid to pay for his defense. Meanwhile, his brothers Richard and Walter were tried in relation to weapons, drugs, and stolen items found on their properties. A committal hearing for the murders was held for Milat on October 24th and lasted until December 12th. Over 200 witnesses appeared at this hearing. Based on the evidence, at the beginning of February 1995, Ivan was remanded to custody until June of that same year. The trial began on March 26, 1996, at New South Wales Supreme Court. His defense team argued that all the evidence against him was circumstantial and attempted to shift the blame onto his younger brothers, Richard and Walter. The trial lasted 18 weeks. 145 witnesses took the stands and over 600 photographs were entered into evidence. Members of the Milat family took the stand and attempted to provide alibis, and Ivan took the stand himself on June 18th. On July 27, 1996, the jury found Ivan Milat guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 7 life sentences for each of the backpackers without the possibility of parole. For the attempted murder, false imprisonment, and armed robbery of Paul Onions, Milat received an additional 18 years, 6 years for each charge. Police maintain that based on Ivan Milat's MO, they believe that he committed additional attacks and murders, but were unable to conclusively prove it was him. A few of the cases he is suspected of having committed include Karen Rollins, 20, disappeared in February 1971 and was found in Fairbairn Pine Plantation. Paul Letcher, 18, disappeared in November 1987 and was found in Joe Lane State Forest in 1988. Diane Panaccio, 29, disappeared September 1991 and was found in Talaganda State Forest. In 2001, Ivan Milat was ordered to give evidence at an inquest into the disappearances of 3 other female backpackers who disappeared between 1978 and 1979. Leanne Goodall, 20, Robin Hickey, 18, and Amanda Robinson, 14, all disappeared from the Newcastle area. He was also suspected in the murders of Amanda Gonzalez, 16, and Annette Briffa, 18, both of whom were never seen or heard from again. Susan Ishenwood, 22, was also a suspected victim of Milat's. Her skeletal remains were found in Kaiwark State Forest. He was only found to be a person of interest in these cases, and no charges were ever filed against him. In 2005, James Marsden, Milat's former lawyer, made a deathbed confession that Ivan had been assisted by his sister, Shirley Soare, in the murders of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. Their younger brother George Milat is quoted as having saying, "I can't really say Shirley did commit murders. All I can do is say that she was involved." It was alleged that Shirley and Ivan had been having a sexual relationship since the 1950s. Shirley had passed away in 2003, so no charges could be brought against her. In May 1997, while in prison, Ivan and fellow inmate George Savas attempted to escape. The plan failed when Savas was found hanging in his cell the next day. Milat was transferred to Goulburn Correctional Center. He was kept in the maximum security section. He made several appeals throughout his incarceration, but they were all dismissed, including a 2004 request to be granted a furlough from prison. On January 26, 2009, Milat cut off his own finger with a plastic knife with the intention of mailing it to the High Court of Australia to force an appeal. He was returned to the prison just 1 day after being taken to hospital, where the doctor said that surgery wasn't possible. This wasn't the first time Ivan had harmed himself while in prison. He had previously swallowed razor blades, staples, and other metal objects. In May 2019, Milat was transferred to Prince of Wales Hospital, Randwick, where he was diagnosed as having terminal cancer of the esophagus. On October 27, 2019, Ivan Milat died from esophagus and stomach cancer. Random fact, the film Wolf Creek and Wolf Creek 2 are based on this case. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Crafts and Crimes. This has been my longest case so far. If you're interested in the things I'm crafting, please check out the links in the description. If you found this video interesting, please leave a like and comment below with what future cases you want me to talk about. Don't forget to subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss out on any of my future uploads. I'll see you all next time.